Well, here we are. Get this right side up. Finishing up now in chapter 7, Discourse and Ideology of Eagleton's book, Ideology. And I might be able to just finish this book, no, sorry, this chapter in this video, okay? And then we'll do the conclusion in the next chapter. So stay tuned for that. All right, so what's going on here? Discourse and Ideology, no big surprise if you think about it that one of Eagleson's criticisms is going to be that, you know what, after we looked at all these different ways that ideologies are quote unquote kind of instantiated, either in social relations or institutions and all these places, that once it's seen to be instantiated in a discourse formation, which is basically kind of like a powered language, right? When you study discourse formations, you're not studying it from this abstract sort of a purely linguistic notion or whatever. You're discussing it, in terms of what the language can do, what the language game or the language manner of speaking can do, what power it has. It's not a surprise that Eagleton's going to say this notion of language being the whole domain, of ideology eventually is going to have where language, guess what? It does kind of what those old positive dialectics did that guys like Adorno were worried about, that it's going to leave no room for another. It's just going to completely swallow everything up, and everything will become not just language, but everything will become some sort of power game of language. Okay, so let's see where, and it's not surprising again because this whole post-Marxist tradition, he thinks it's rooted back in guys like Schopenhauer and especially Nietzsche. Okay, so let's pick up on this. Just a little bit, a quick sort of a review of what I chatted about. The post-Marxism, post-Marxist tradition is the analysis of discourse formations, or what, like, kind of like a powered language, or in a powered subset of language, not the whole thing, but a powered subset. Like, this is the way we talk, and this is how things get done, because our way of talking leads in those directions. So that's a discourse. And this tradition, as I sort of talked about just a second ago here, it pushes the irrationalist tradition, which I've labeled with an IT because I'm going to use it down here. It pushes this irrationalist tradition to its logical conclusion. Kind of funny, this sort of irrationalist, non-logical tradition pushing it to its logical conclusion. What do you get when you take that strong Nietzschean line of the world and is some kind of primordial something or chaos, or maybe the world is kind of a will, or maybe in the end it's just power dividing the world up. But basically the thing is that either the will or power, according to guys like Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, that does all the work. That carves everything up. You can't talk about anything outside of the will or outside of power. You can't. That doesn't make any sense to talk about that. So it's not surprising when you have a big boundary like will or power, and then you say, oh, that's kind of a discourse formation. Well, then there's nothing outside of a discourse formation. So it's not surprising that you end up with that. Doesn't mean it's wrong, it's just not surprising. Okay, so chapter 6, yes, before this, rooted in that. We looked at that. In chapter 7, we were talking and ended up recently on the Hindress and Hurst, the little HH thing, that there was no logical link, so they're post-Marxist. They don't think that social interests and structures are just kind of laying around for the theory to grasp. Rather, again, they have this very strong Nietzschean background. These are kinds of constructions. And so there's no logical link, which I've illustrated here, or I've indicated here by this little asterisk, between the social position of the subject and the subject's desire. So have a look at the previous video if that doesn't make much sense to you. This is just a quick recap. So desires are some kind of they're constructions for Hindress and Hurst. And so this kind of generates, as Eagleton says, and I tried to lay out as clearly as I could, a sort of a dilemma. Remember, a dilemma isn't just a choice. It's a choice between two bad things, and you're just trying to figure out what's worse. It's not like a hard choice between something tough and something immoral. But no, both things could arguably immoral or unacceptable. That's what a dilemma is. A dilemma is not just a hard choice. It's something more specific than that. Okay, but I digress. So the dilemma, from this no logical link here, we seem to be forced into either the HH view, right? That desires are construction. So it's this massive project of construction. Almost everything becomes a construction. Why? Well, because in the background lies this general metaphysical, if I may use that term, position that ultimately it's power that carves these things up, carves out subjects, carves out and constructs these kinds of things. Not just carves them out like they're already there and it just kind of, like Michelangelo used to say, the statue's already there and I just kind of chip away the non-statue stuff. No, it's actually constructing, right? So in the HH view, if these are all desires or constructions, the subject is kind of this fantasizer, right? Making stuff up. Or you get this causal view as which is sort of a real strong reductionist, is that, okay, well, maybe then the subject then is not even anything to begin with. It's just completely something that's caused, right, by it causes the subject's desires and it strips away the agency of the subject. So, you just happen to be in a place which is something that's itself is constructed, and then that construction constructs you, which in turn constructs your interest. So it's all construction pretty well all the way down until you get maybe some highly abstract notion of, there's power lurking in the background doing the construction. And Schopenhauer would say, yeah, and it's a blind will. So it's all kind of this sort of basically meaningless thing, not complete nihilism, but pretty close. So you either get this subject as the fantasizer, which seems unpalatable, or subject as the billiard ball. And Eagleton says, both of these kind of strip us of being embodied subjects. Remember, he talked about this notion of, wait a second, instead of this logical link, there's a kind of internal relation between subjects' desires and their positions, right? It's a little bit richer and deeper than this no logical link here, in the sense of, the no logical link doesn't force us to take sort of radical opposition. We could take this internal relation, which deals with, subjects. They have consciousness and they may not be fully formed, but they are they're embodied. They're taking, information from their environment and developing it, thinking it through. They're not pure fantasizers, and we're neither pure fantasizers nor billiard balls, right? And so I talked a little bit about what an internal relation might mean. It's a notion that involves justification, explanation, and not mere causal force. And he says, okay, then the next couple of thinkers is that he talks about are Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe. Okay, they are, he says, according to Eagleton, that these two thinkers, interesting, they're kind of at the end of this tradition, according to Eagleton, that, again, end of this, or the fulfillment of it, not necessarily the end as it stops, but kind of the fruition and the flowering of it comes out in their thought. They want to navigate this dilemma. They seem to be sympathetic to yes, this is the dilemma, and they accept it, but they don't want the strict HA view that we're completely fantasized, and they too don't want the billiard ball view. So in other words, they're kind of like, they've got sentiments that are sort of in line with Eagleton. It's like, yeah, this is this dilemma. It's something real, but it's not completely something we have to accept and just go on one side or the other. But Eagleton says, he's got a number of comments, interesting comments about them, is that in the end, he finds that according to the text, they're not entirely consistent. Some texts lean towards a strong notion of construction. So in the dilemma, they would come out over here like, oh, they're more of a construction. And so they would lean more towards the subject being a construction, the subject's desires being a construction. And then other times they have weaker notion of construction, which is not necessarily to go down into the billiard ball model, but it seems to be going more towards this idea that, the hegemonic forces modify the subject. What does that really mean? Eagleton has a few comments on that, but nonetheless, I think you can safely say that for Eagleton, he thinks that they don't really resolve this. All right. And Eagleton he has a lot more to say, but he I'm going to leave it off at that. But he says that he follows, and is sort of his concluding discussion in this chapter. He follows the critic Perry Anderson, who says that the irrationalist tradition, IT, the irrationalist tradition leads to basically an inflation of discourse. Like I said at the outset of the video, like sort of everything is sort of the new positive dialectics really is discourse analysis. Oh, everything, like even everything that you could think of and talk about, and all, like things and everything, it's all just language. That's all we can do is think and move and talk about language. As Heidegger would say, it's the house of being. You can't get out of the house of being. That's the whole story. So everything is language, but not just language. Everything is discourse. Everything is some kind of powered language, right? Everything's a discourse. So whenever you're trying to talk about stuff, right, you never really get to this stuff. You're just in these powered discourses, these powered language games. He says that Leclerc and Leclerc and Mouffe, they deny the distinction between discursive and non-discursive practices. Hence, everything becomes a discursive practice. Everything becomes just some kind of language, a powered language game. And if that's the case, well, he says, okay, well, what happens? But he says, well, look, he says, look, you can describe any object in terms of language. Yeah, that's not really saying all that much to say I can describe in terms of language. What does it mean to describe? It means to use language. You can describe buildings, architecture. You can describe them in terms of recipes, how to build one, right? How it got there, et cetera, et cetera. That's fine. Physics has all kinds of languages that it uses to describe the world. But just because any practice, like any physical activity, says Eagleton, can be described in terms of a discourse formation or whatever. Oh yeah, physics is a kind of discourse formation where there's a certain kind of power structure, which what gets to be a real experiment, what doesn't get to be a real experiment, what gets to be real things that we can offer and will fund, so it's got connections to power and money. Sure, you can talk about it like that. That's no problem. But the actual description of the practice and all the things in it, that's not the actual practice itself. That's a description of the practice. In the old Buddhist notion of Buddhist aphorism, use your finger to point to the moon, but don't confuse your finger with the moon, right? So you use theories as descriptions and tools, but, don't mistake the tool for what you're operating on. Hammer is a tool, but the hammer is just a tool. It's not the nail or the finished building itself. It's a tool in a process. So this notion to say that discursive everything is discursive and deny the non-discursive, Eagleton says this is some kind of projection, right? This is a projection of our way of understanding onto the object understood, right? This is to confuse knowing and being, right? To use good old scholastic language. Is ways of knowing might reflect ways of being. Maybe the ways of knowing are the only ways that we have access to being, but once again, don't confuse the knowing with being. Don't confuse the discursive practice with the non-discursive object or the non-discursive practice, right? So again, you can give recipes for baking cakes, but recipes aren't the baking of cakes, right? The rules of chess and the description of chess, they don't play chess. Right? Subjects play chess, and chess is a physical activity. It's not a discursive practice, although you have a discursive practice that can help you understand what's going on in the actual practice. So he thinks that there's an intellectual sleight of hand going on to replace the practice, the thing going on in the world with the description of it and all the power relations, all the things that we talked about. And he says, again, back to the example he gave, and I talked about in a previous video, that there might be all kinds of discursive practices. One might be our modern chemical way of talking about matter, and we have a discursive practice. Part of that is to distinguish between water and sulfuric acid. And sure, that's that's part of a discursive practice. But of course, anybody who says, oh, that's a discursive practice, or that's the whole thing, and you could have other discursive practices that don't recognize that distinction, well, good luck with that. Same thing with gravity. Newtonian gravity might be part. You could trace it as some kind of, not Newtonian, but the theory of gravity could be, discussed as a discursive kind of practice. Fine. There's all kinds of things that Newton did where he, more or less declared, I'm going to ignore, this is irrelevant, this will not be part of my discussion, that will not, I'm going to concentrate on this, I'm going to talk about point masses. He introduced certain kinds of, shall we say, useful fictions into science, and then said certain other things I'm not going to talk about. And then he built this theory of gravity. But he was the first to say, it's not gravity itself. My equations are awesome. He had a good, healthy view of what he did, but he didn't say that they capture everything that's going on in the world. And they're not the world itself. They're a window on it. So again, don't confuse the window with the scenery outside. It's, I think, what Eagleton's getting at here. And again, if you want to say, I don't believe in gravity, well, I wouldn't test that out too rigorously, because you'll find you'll get hurt. And he thinks that this move, ultimately, this tradition will be a bad thing for the study of ideology, because it will obscure lots of things. If you just say it's all power relations, you won't really have a place to stand to talk about it, because you'll always be accused of being in another power discourse, or sorry, another powered language, which is just another discourse formation. So if ideas and material reality are totally linked, there's no real way to ask where social ideas come from or anything. This is a neo-Nietzschean manner of seeing the world, and all order, everything's is either chaos and then pressed into the service of some kind of power. And so there's only, these hegemonic forms that we can talk about. And discourse is sort of the new, as he said, discourse is prior to everything, and it's the new transcendental structure. What does it mean by that? I think that's sort of an allusion to Kant, where transcendental structures weren't necessarily transcendent structures, like, structures, ontological structures built into being, but transcendental structures in the Kantian sense were, to simplify, but I think to get Kant's point, they are ways in which information can be constructed and organized. So you can't think outside of transcendental structures, according to Kant. It doesn't. You'll end up with all kinds of problems, and he discusses in the Critique of Pure Reason what happens when you try and get outside of the transcendental structures. You get all kinds of contradictions and crazy stuff happening. So in this sense, discourse becomes the new transcendental structures. You can, maybe at best, you can move from one to another, but you can't talk about them in and of themselves, because you're always talking within one about the others. You have no real secure place to stand. And so post-Marxism, ultimately, Eagleton implies, is that it really leads us to putting a ban on where ideas originate. We can't really talk about that in a true and deep sense. We can, he says, turn this all back kind of on itself, and note that the entire project of the post-Marxism, this entire tradition, is itself kind of a victim of its own thinking. In the sense, how does that work? Well, he says that it's been stressing this sort of link of this historical link between certain ideas and certain views, and trying to deconstruct them all, denying that there's any kind of necessary link of society and time and consciousness and all that. Now, it's all historical. And so in that sense, we're going to go after any kind of supposed ideological naturalization or ideological universalization. Those are all contingent historical things. We're going to chip those back and break them up and deconstruct them. But in the end, it sort of gives us this deep connection. Oh, we have this deep metaphysical view of the new transcendentalism is everything is these powered languages. This notion of, oh, well, the field of the world, right? I can grasp that now. It's all just a series of powered discourses, powered languages that are carving up this ineffable world, this Nietzschean chaos in the service of power. This viewpoint that I just articulated, the world as this collection of powered discourses and things like that, that too has a historical origin. And that is, Eagleton says, that's kind of hidden by its own rhetoric, right? So it's doing, sort of elevating itself up as, well, this is a natural position to see that the world is like this. Whereas, no, actually, this too comes from a certain place, as he said. This is... it has a historical origin in necessarily as a late stage of capitalism or whatever, that it kind of hides in its own rhetoric. All right, so it offers a sort of this historical deconstruction of everything except for itself. And Eagleton says, yeah, that's actually in the end that something that says everything else is a historical construction except for this view. Naturally, Eagleton says, boy, does that not sound like ideology in and of itself. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 7. And stay tuned because I'll go into the conclusions and we'll finish up with this book. Take care.